Professor Emeritus, Rhode Island College. Thanks for coming into the studio.
I think it's great being here.
Well, it's amazing that we've been here at GoLocal for a year, and this is the first opportunity I've had to get you in. I've had you.
Just written comments.
Just written comments, because I said, have we not had him in here? We oftentimes pick your brain for everything that's going on locally and around the country. And I'm so glad I can pick your brain because so much going on right now in the combination of the political and the communication spheres and how media is covering politics right now. And one of the things I want to start with was the March for Our Lives. Around the country this past weekend, we saw the numbers turning out in DC and here as well. Let's talk a little bit about the event itself and the media coverage surrounding it.
Well, the event in and of itself was fairly significant, but the interesting thing was the way the media opted to either highlight it or downplay it. For example, if you grabbed the Providence Journal, it says, in Rhode Island, thousands jam State House. If you checked online, some of the TV stations weren't listing it as thousands, they were listing it as hundreds. Typical situation where, do you downplay it or do you build it up? Nationally, those that tended to be more towards what the students were doing, talked about the rally as being the largest youth-motivated rally of its type. On the other hand, people were comparing it to the Women's March, which was a significant number, and it was comparable, or they were comparing it to the inauguration turnout. Depending on which side you wanted to emphasize, you mentioned the inauguration turnout. If you were trying to build up the importance of the rally, you compared it to the Women's March if you wanted to sort of push it down. And it's that manipulation.
It is absolutely there, and I'll tell you, I saw that picture because it showed that inauguration picture. Now, we've seen the comparisons between Trump and Obama after the Trump administration tried to say, but you can take pictures at different times. And also, they were on Pennsylvania Avenue. They weren't on the mall.
Right.
So it was a little bit of apples and oranges, saying who was on the mall for Trump and who was on Pennsylvania Avenue. But you're correct in the numbers game. GoLocal was up at the State House probably about 3 weeks ago. It was a very pro-NRA day. There was some legislation, some gun bills. There were a small number of Moms Demand Gun Action folks, but it was overwhelmingly pro-NRA on this particular day. This was their turnout event. And some media organizations said it was a wash of yellow and red. It was a sea of yellow with a smattering of red.
It's interesting. Again, this is far away, but if you checked Salt Lake City, of all places, they had a rally of about 800 that were pushing for, reform. They had a rally similarly at a slightly different location of 200 people that were backing the Second Amendment. Media coverage, approximately the same. If you went on the local paper at the Salt Lake Tribune, there were 8 shots printed in the paper. 6 dealt with those opposing any change, 2 with those that were proponents.
Again, it's all in the media coverage of it, and we saw so much surrounding Saturday, but I think the question now, one that we have talked about, what now? This was a huge media event, and we're here, it's Tuesday. What do we expect moving forward?
I think the big difference is going to be whether the proponents are able to, number one, maintain and push for registration. The big thing that they're talking about today is the fact that the proponents of the march are actually encouraging parents to sign a pledge that they will not vote for someone that is not pro gun restriction. That can make a difference. I think in states like Rhode Island, it's a slightly different situation. Sheldon Whitehouse, Jack Reed, both of our congresspeople aren't going to be voting any differently than the youth were basically advocating. The result is it's not going to necessarily help them. The difference might be on the slightly lower level where you've got the Montiellos who seem to be, quote, in the pocket of the NRA, and there that turnout might make a difference. It might be enough to make a push.
So it is interesting, and one of the things that folks keep pointing to is this, this generation of young students being the, right now going to be the largest voting bloc in just a few years if they're not already at that 18-year-old level. Will we continue to see these young students being on national press moving forward. You talk about legislative action, but just from a pure communication standpoint, we've seen the March for Our Lives. Does it depend on what they do from a public standpoint, if they do more public-facing events?
The thing about today's youth that's a little bit different, that generation, that is, those from 18 to about 28, tends to be the lowest in terms of turnout. Seems to be the lowest in terms of involvement. But the funny thing that's occurring is their numbers are going up. And even though they're lower, the degree of lowness, shall we call it, isn't as great as it used to be.
Yep.
And I think we may be seeing a major trend. In other words, the difference in what the electoral process looks like now may not be apparent for 6, 8 years. But about 8 years from now, things can change drastically.
That is for sure. We've seen it in recent years, and just based on this action and moving forward, it's going to be interesting. And lastly, let's talk with the March for Our Lives and what happened in Florida. An interesting vantage point. YouTube, just after the shooting happened at the school, there'd been that conspiracy theory of student actors and things of that nature, and YouTube pulled the video down. Do you think that, again, in this world of conspiracy theories, that media and organizations are taking a more active role? I mean, that was an editorial call by the part of YouTube to pull something down.
I think what's happening is that if you're going to survive as a media forum, you've got to begin to look at your audience. And the conspiratorial audience isn't that large that it's going to make or break you. I think it's going to be more and more inherent upon those media outlets to be more responsible. And I think that factor of, if you watched The Daily Show last night, there was a great line when it was suggested that it was a conspiracy to get those high school students, and they were actors, and the question was that a conspiracy in terms of trying to get them involved? It gets more preposterous as time goes on.
It was interesting to see YouTube pull that down, and as you say, talking about organizations making those calls moving forward. But let's talk a little bit about the Second Amendment before we go to some other politics. John Paul Stevens called to repeal the Second Amendment.
The best way to look at it is he's trying to present one possibility to maybe get the NRA to move on others. The likelihood of our getting an amendment to repeal the Second Amendment is pretty slight. We can't even, let's put it this, in the 60s and 70s, we couldn't even get an amendment that allowed women to have equal rights with men. I mean, that one died a very slow death. It could take 10, 15 years just to go through the amendment process. And let's face it, given the money and given the electoral situation right now, it's not likely that we're going to see that amendment enacted. However, the threat, that becomes the interesting thing. Can it get people that are locked in one position maybe to try to move a little bit more towards the general public consensus?
What was your reaction when you saw that headline today?
At first I went, wow.
Did you think maybe it was the Onion or?
No, I think the thing that struck me was that, number one, he's not on the court right now.
Yes.
Two, when he was on the court, he took a position fairly similar to it. But it still was in the minority. And given that, it's a very difficult thing to do.
Well, it was all in the news last weekend, and again, still continues to be, but wanted to start off talking with, again, the interplay of politics and media with the March for Our Lives. Let's talk about politics and media. Of course, we have to talk about Stormy Daniels, 60 Minutes, and where things are now. This is D.C. politics. This is focused on the Trump administration. This is focused on the election and the campaign. We saw her interview. We've seen the back and forth. She just, she issued the defamation suit.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I don't know if it's going to have a major effect. I mean, the real effect of all she's saying and all that's going on is going to be whether it plays well in the courts. It isn't going to make a big difference in terms of voter turnout or voter interest. I think President Clinton, not that I want to say they're comparable, but his situation, I think, pretty much opened the door for that to occur and to be discussed without necessarily causing great harm.
So it's interesting, we often talk with Jennifer Lawless about this, and she's raised those parallels to how the Monica Lewinsky info essentially kind of came out of Whitewater, and the issues that for President Clinton obviously were the perjuring of himself. But let's talk about the angle that the Stormy Daniels folks are taking and the purported $130,000, the campaign contribution angle. Are we ever going to, when are we going to know more about this?
I don't know that we ever will. In other words, I think it all depends on how it plays in the courts. I have to wonder, as I'm sure a great number of people do, why you get $139,000 not to talk about something that you didn't do.
Well, if it's there in the bank statement, if, back in early November, she just had a deposit of $139,000, I mean, there has to be some paper trail that somewhere, one would think.
Yes, but I mean, it's a situation where denial, in part, is a confirmation. And confirmation isn't going to occur, but the fact that you're even addressing it, it's fodder for discussion for the next week or two. The question is, what is it covering up? And I don't mean that in a conspiratorial form, but rather, what other news would we be looking at if we weren't looking at that?
So here we are. We're in 2018. The Trump's been in the office more than a year now. It's just always one thing after another. It's very little, it seems, focused on policy and a lot focused on media and what's what he's tweeting, or from the Mueller investigation and kind of all these distractions. Are we going to see distraction politics for the rest of the Trump administration?
I tend to think so. When people voted for Trump, a lot of them voted for him because they didn't want politics as usual.
Well, this is not politics
that's
as
exactly
usual.
what they got. I think, in essence, at least from my perspective, they elected a president, or let's put it this: the Electoral College was able to maintain a sufficient majority for a president who basically is not a politician. But not being a politician isn't necessarily meaning that you're capable of being a good politician. It means that you maybe have other strengths. His tends to be utilization of media. And it tends to be occurring in a time when the media is less able to focus and do what used to be their job. The days of portrayed in the movie The Post are long gone.
And so, it's interesting to look at as well, and one of the things that I've talked about here is Trump's on the Apprentice predilection for firing people himself, and then he gets to the White House, doesn't appear to do it himself.
It's probably not as well scripted. I mean, one thing you have to remember is reality shows frequently aren't reality.
No, they certainly are not, but we keep an eye on what's going on down in D.C., and I appreciate getting your vantage point. Let's come even closer to home while we have you here. Let's just look at a broad picture of the 2018 governor's race here. We had former Secretary of State Matt Brown in when he said he was putting together an exploratory committee to look at an independent run. Now we've got Joe Trillo as an independent, potentially Matt Brown, looking at the Republican side. Are things going to look a little different in September?
I don't know that they will. It seems to me that what we have is a lot of names floating about, most of which don't necessarily mean anything to most of us. There are perhaps 3 or 4 names that are being floated, including the governors, that have some degree of recognition. And it seems to me it becomes a matter then of how those candidates posture themselves. Governor Raimondo is going to have to be the governor of the state, but not necessarily be aligned with the Democratic Party in the state in the way that she used to be. She is not necessarily going to be making popularity points with the Speaker or the President of the Senate. That's a given. Fung and Morgan are going to be, who knows what's going to happen with the two of them. Fung is the loser from the last election, but the question is, was that his high point, or does he have more ground to gain in this next one?
We've seen some numbers up there, and again, people talk about that number remaining steady. Let's talk a little bit about Matt Brown when he kicked off that potential exploratory campaign. Very left, very much a Bernie-crat. We saw what happened in the 2016 election with the support for Hillary by the governor. He runs to the left of her. Is she in a quandary of Democrats who, for some, that she appears to be too conservative?
I think whether he runs that way or not, it's not that significant in terms of her vote. The reality is that she's perceived as being a moderate to a conservative Democrat. His question is whether he will draw out voters that would either want to sit home or would be willing to vote for her despite her conservative leanings. I don't know what that number is. I mean, he ran and was successful for one statewide office and then left the state. It doesn't necessarily mark the indication of a solid organization. And I think we have a lot of candidates nowadays running what you might call Bernie fumes. That is, they saw how Bernie did in the last election, that is up to the nomination, and feel that that's the movement going forward. Interestingly enough, in some of the races we're seeing, I think it was in, I'm trying to think which community, but anyhow, one one congressional race, there was a massive movement by the progressives to try to get a new nominee, and the incumbent was able to win the nomination again by being a moderate. And if you look at what happened in Pennsylvania, yes, he's a Democrat. Yes, he's perceived as being anti-Trump, but he's also a moderate. And what we're beginning to see, I think nationally at least, is a broadening of what the Democratic Party is about. More concerned about trying to keep things in check than necessarily rubber stamping one viewpoint or one position.
One of the points that was made up when Matt Brown was made the announcement about potentially getting in the race, when Joe Trillo announced he was going to run as an independent, you sort of heard gnashing of the teeth on the Republican side, saying you're going to perhaps provide that wedge to provide an entry to if Raimondo is to emerge from the Democratic primary. One point was raised as if the Democrats realized that Matt Brown siphoning off or getting sort of the Bernie fumes, if you will, could actually present a legitimate challenge to a Democrat ultimately winning. Would the Democrats realize the quandary in which they're in when they go to the voting block and say, well, maybe a vote for Matt Brown might be a vote for the Republican?
It's a possibility, but the whole issue really comes down to the way things are going to play, not now, but once the election season starts. Quite honestly, I wonder how many people would identify Joe Trillo. I wonder how many people, if you said, who is Matt Brown, would know, would confuse him with, we'll say, the university. I'm just not sure that it's that effective.
The name recognition factor.
Yes.
Well, I'll tell you, we did the polling with John Del Vope in Harvard last fall. There's a whole new set of players, there's a whole new set of circumstances. We saw some recent polling as well that was pretty much moot when Matt Brown was, again, looking at the race. So we're going to keep an eye on the gubernatorial race, keep an eye on D.C. politics, keep an eye on gun politics. And I appreciate your coming in today to provide your vantage point. Kay Israel, Professor Emeritus, Rhode Island College, thank you for your time.
Nice being here.
Okay, I'll let you go around the corner, and I'll welcome my next guest. Kay Israel, we've always been able to tap his political and communications expertise here. First time in the studio, giving us his thoughts on some recent events, the March for Our Lives, Stormy Daniels, but getting a little closer to home where things might stand with the governor's race. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back with our next guest here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center.